about now? Okay, good. Well, good morning. It's good to be here in Savannah. I don't know if the name Winkler means anything to the southeastern part of the United States, but I've had a lot of family related to this part of the world. My grandfather was basically a non-believer as my father was being raised in the Port Arthur, Texas area. But as my parents used to say, Papa came out of the pulpit and came out of the baptistry preaching. And so my grandfather, Paul Winkler Sr., preached all over the Southeast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida. And then his son, my dad's younger brother, Wendell, probably became even more well-known. Wendell preached primarily in Texas, but also in Alabama. He went to what was then called Alabama Christian, now Faulkner. And then later in his career, he ended up back at Faulkner in the Bible department, teaching Bible and heading the Bible department for a while before he retired from preaching. His two oldest sons, my two older cousins, Dan and Mike, have both been preachers. Dan has retired from primarily preaching in Tennessee, although he preached in Texas as well as Alabama. And then Mike preached not only in Alabama, but also South Carolina, and finished his preaching just recently in the Huntsville area of Alabama. So Mike and Dan are both retired. My uncle Wendell passed away in 2005, I believe, and my aunt, his wife, just passed away last summer. So, both of my parents have passed, but when I was a young kid, I thought because of my granddad and my uncle, Wendell was the preacher at the church I grew up at. So I grew up with my dad as an elder and my uncle as the preacher. He couldn't get away with too much. And then I saw my two older cousins go into ministry as well, and I thought I really might want to do that as well. But my dad kind of saw this geeky little kid that, you know, if you remember when calculators first became available, I had one on my hip pocket, kind of like this speaker. And I knew how to use a slide rule and things like that. And he said, you know, you might want to think about serving God in a different way with your talents. And so ultimately, by the time I was finishing high school, I really was very interested in going into medicine and chose to do so. Went to med school in the Dallas area. I went to college at Oklahoma Christian, came back to Texas to go to med school. And then, like my family before me, I had needed to come to the Southeast, so I did my residency in Tuscaloosa. So went back to Texas, where my wife and I, who'd known each other in high school, reconnected and got married about a year after I started my practice in the Dallas area, in Garland, technically. And that's where we've lived and still live today. So there's a quick history there. I'll get to my career currently, because I am no longer doing any active medical practice right now. I was doing part-time practice until about 2 years ago, and I'm working completely, and I'll talk about Discovery Institute in just a second. But let's go to God in prayer. Father, thank you for a chance to be with fellow believers, some I've never met, but know I have a lot in common. And thank you for the time to share a message today with them, and I just pray for this church here that it'll thrive and be the beacon of light and truth. And bless our Bible time together, Father, and hopefully we can leave edified and encouraged. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I have the wrong slideshow up on my computer. The right one's up behind me. I'm going to switch real quick. I wasn't even paying attention. I've got two slideshows. Let me close this one out and pull up my other one. Technical skills are not at my strong suit. So let me pull up the one that's behind me here. Try to get that set. So, Darwin's corrosive idea, exposing the logical and historical consequences of the influential theory. I'm just going to tell you right now that the idea that this theory and the influence it has, it makes me very angry. I see what it's doing to our culture, and I really enjoy an opportunity to share about this because I think the truth is just not well told about it right now. So the Center for Science and Culture is the program within Discovery Institute that I work for. And what is Discovery Institute? It is formed in 1990 as a social policy think tank. It had no real scientific component to it when it was founded. It was founded by two gentlemen who were Harvard roommates, and they wanted to form a think tank similar to conservative think tanks on the East Coast, but they wanted to form it on the West Coast. And Seattle, Washington, where one of them was from, is where they decided to form this think tank in 1990. And their goal was to promote Judeo-Christian values, but they were purposefully, intentionally, although both men were Christians and devout believers, they did not want their think tank to be officially associated with any one religion or any one political party. And they were not going to promote a particular faith or a particular political party, but nonetheless were going to promote the Judeo-Christian values that were at the core of founding the United States Constitution. And so, after about 6 years of doing this, what's a think tank do? It writes articles, produces books, puts on seminars, and tries to influence the culture to remind our culture of the values it was founded on in the United States. Well, the more they began to do what they were doing, they found out that the cultural battles they were facing were rooted in something much more deeper than exactly how you want to do economic policy or how you want to do education policy. They were really they were really rooted much deeper than that, and the deeper problem was a culture in this country gradually becoming less and less tied to a belief in God. When you don't win that part of the argument, if you can't start from there, it really downstream makes it very difficult to make decisions that are based on the kind of things the United States was founded on. So they woke up and realized we're fighting this on the wrong level, and there's a long story to it, but basically a policy shift occurred, and they've created a new program called the Center for Science and Culture in '96. So 6 years after Discovery Institute was formed, the Center for Science and Culture became another program among the others that were already there. And what was it going to do? It was going to argue against the atheistic worldview, but rather from the scriptures, it was going to argue from science, right? As you probably know, when you're talking to somebody who's a non-believer and you want to talk about the existence of God, it's kind of a non-starter to open up the Word of God when they don't believe in God in the first place. So you had to find some way, and I like to say we decided to take the battle to the enemy's playing field, okay? And the enemy's a very strong enemy and has an amazing influence over in Hollywood, in politics, in the academy, which is the worst. Major universities, media, there's just so many influences that the atheistic worldview has that it was a big, big battle to fight. So, the Center for Science and Culture's mission statement is to seek to advance the understanding that human beings and nature are the result of intelligent design rather than a blind and undirected process. Now, the enemy recognizes what we're doing here. And if you go to Wikipedia and look up Discovery Institute, we are listed as pseudo-scientists, creationists, and they're trying to marginalize us by telling us that we're just Bible people in disguise. In a way, they're kind of right, because most of the people in our organization are Christians. Although, because it's not officially a religious or political we have in our organization people that work for us that are Jewish or frankly are agnostic, but they don't like the science behind Charles Darwin, and so we've got kind of a broad tent of people that work for us. Some of our main speakers are overtly agnostic. One that we'll not talk about today, but his name is David Berlinski, is almost a secular Jew, but he does not think Darwin is good science. He's very respectful of the Christian faith, but he's not necessarily claimed it yet. But he'll tell the critics, look, You can call these guys creationists you want to, but that's not me. And the point was they welcome me. It's a broad tent. So do I want David Belinsky and others that work for us to become followers of Jesus? Absolutely I do. But the truth of the matter is, if you want to call us a Christian organization, it's really not a fair determination. I don't mind it, and most of all of us, including myself, when I talk about Discovery Institute, I don't hide who I am, and most of our main speakers talk about their Christian faith openly, but we don't argue for the existence of God from our Christian faith. Does that make sense? So if you've got a young kid in college that's got impressionable mind, he's been influenced by his education through our very screwed up education system, by the time he leaves home, he's already doubting God's existence anyway. And if you want to talk to him, maybe he's still open-minded, but to open up the Bible isn't going to get you. But we've got really, really good stuff going on in several sciences: biology, physics, chemistry, biochemistry, neuroscience, astronomy, that point toward God. And we don't have to use the Bible, even though the Bible supports what we talk about. Let's look at our culture. And if any of you have ever read anything by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he's a pretty interesting author, grew up in Russia. This is a comment that he made that's incredibly predictive of the Western spread of atheism. While I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Problem is, it's not just in Russia, as we know. It's spread through Western Europe, and everything that happens in Western Europe always makes it across the ocean to us. And frankly, there's just some disasters in our culture because of this. Teen suicide, mass shootings, breakdown of the family, out-of-wedlock births, belief in gender fluidity, medical mutilation, promiscuity, illegitimacy, and abortion, crime waves, fentanyl deaths. All of this are downstream fruits of a culture that's losing its way from God. This was a survey done by the Gallup poll in 2022, so just 2 years ago. And at that point, pretty shocking that the belief in the God in the United States had dipped to 81%. It's about 50% in Europe. I think even lower than that in the UK right now. So usually the trends there are going to make their way here. And if you look back historically, that's been the case. So, and this is a really low bar, by the way. Just, do you believe in God? And people can say that, but what, about their life is reflective in that. People that may never have graced a church door have still thought, well, I believe in God. It's cool, But it's a pretty low bar when you talk about real active faith, the kind of faith that's going to change a lifestyle. If you look at the trend here, it's really dropped off dramatically. If you see about 2015, it was just around 90%, and then by 2020, it was just past 2020, it was already down to 81%. That's not a very good-looking curve there. It's moving in the wrong direction. We also, Discovery Institute did a survey, and we found that 65% of people that call themselves atheists and 43% of agnostics believe that the findings of science make the existence of God less probable. In other words, the message in the culture is you cannot have a faith in God and believe in science, or if you believe in science, you can't have a faith in God. That's where the trend is going. Science and religion, science and belief in God are at cross purposes. That's where we are, and that's where it's going. The new atheists are this was a big deal maybe in the first decade of this century, but people like Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, Stephen Hawking, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Steven Weinberg of the great University of Texas, all of these guys were really promoting and making lots and lots of monies on their books about atheism. There's others, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. This is just a sampling of some of these guys were just selling books left and right. Dawkins, I think, is probably the most famous of all of those. But anyway, they're just, frankly, very antagonistic and critical and sarcastic of religion. We also did more surveys in that same survey I pointed out earlier that the scientific theories about the unguided evolution of life have led more people to reject belief in God than worries about suffering, disease, or death. You know, we're all familiar with the questions, how could a loving God allow hurricanes and earthquakes and cancer and all these ugly things that happen? But honestly, the scientific theory that there's no evidence for God from science has had a worse effect on faith than those other things. They all have an effect, don't misunderstand me. But that's what we're up against if we really want to identify what the problems we're having are. So what about Charles Darwin? In the 1800s, he developed this theory based on chance variation and natural selection. He said, you know, if an animal just somehow there's a little mess up in their genetics and they develop maybe a little bit more hairier growth as a sheep, and it's going to help them survive in a cold winter, well, those are going to reproduce, are going to be the ones with that hairier context or that thicker wool, and they're going to be more fit. And so they're going to be the ones that pass down their genes as opposed to the ones who didn't have that change occur. But it's the natural selection. He looked at breeding, artificial breeding, where we as humans affected breeding by breeding a certain thing, by putting certain characteristics together. He said, well, nature does that for us anyway, and that's how we've gotten all we have today. But the key is it's been basically materialistic, and I'll talk about that word in just a second. But take God out of the creation process, okay? Stephen Jay Gould, who's passed away now, was a professor of evolutionary biology at Harvard. So what's Darwin's theory do? It denies the claims of Genesis. You know, we believe, as we open up our Bible, the first page, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But even more importantly, go on down through all the scriptures of the different days of creation, you get down to verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Those are core foundational values that evolution is saying, nope, that happened without any direction. There's no creator. Richard Dawkins, I pointed up a minute ago, said, Darwin gave us the opportunity to be intellectually fulfilled atheists. Why? Because up till that point, when Darwin wrote his book, everyone believed there had to be a God because they looked at the design in nature and intuitively said this couldn't have been an accident. But Darwin tried to take that away and said, no, it's not accidental. It's nature does the selecting, not God, okay? So let's talk about this idea of a materialist worldview. First of all, worldview. Does anyone want to say, when they hear the word worldview, what do you think of when you hear the word worldview? Anyone want to? It's the filter which you look things through, okay? What's the ultimate reality? Just, for instance, if you're a materialist, the ultimate reality is everything can be explained by just the forces of matter and energy. There is no God, there is no supernatural. Everything that we can see around us and explain that happens today is only based on matter and energy. That's a materialist, matter, material, okay? It's another word for atheist, but that's a worldview that's out there. But it does not allow. So that's a worldview. It's got a tree, a duck, a human, a timepiece, the mountains, the sun, the clouds. What's in that worldview? Is there anything to it? Is there a divine influence on that worldview? Materialist worldview says no. Okay? That cannot be. So what's the tenets? What are the basic things that result from that worldview? A, God does not exist. You don't need God. You can explain everything by what's happened in nature without any guiding force. Man arose gradually from lower animals, mindless, undirected. We're accidents of nature by conclusion of this worldview. Human beings have no intrinsic value. And I mean, these guys they don't hide this. Peter Singer from Princeton, a rat is a pig as a dog is a baby. Same things. Those are quotes from people. Free will and objective reality are illusions. You thought you made a choice of what you were going to wear today. No, that's your genes. That's what made you think that. You think you made a choice, but no, you're really controlled by a force of nature. Atoms bouncing around in your brain made that choice for you today. There's no purpose, right? We're just atoms floating around. We're just an accident of nature. These are all the implications. When we die, we rot. Really gets you going, doesn't it? Yeah, okay. Thanks for making my day. Ideas have consequences. Now we'll bring the Bible into this. For as you think in your heart, or as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And so when you have a worldview like that, what's it look like? There's a gentleman that his family gave us permission to share this story. A young kid grew up in the faith, son of a military chaplain, Christian family, military service, good student, commits suicide in October of 2008. Parents are just brokenhearted, as who wouldn't be? What happened? What caused this lovely, gifted, spiritually oriented son to make a decision like that? They found that book in his room and all sorts of scribbles all through it. He had read the book, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, which was a bestseller, came out in the mid-2000s, and it had just ruined his faith. He had not been educated to answer some of the questions. Now, I've read that book. I'll talk about that in just a second. In fact, I'll just go ahead and tell you about it right now. When I was, I'm going to tell you something else, and then we'll go back to the book in a second. Let me go to another story. Do you guys remember the Columbine disaster or the tragedy in 1999? It's been, 25 years. 12 students, a teacher, 23. These two young men, Eric Harris and Dylan, those two kids, killed all those people in their school in Columbine, Colorado. And people, of course, what possessed them to do that? What possibly could have possessed them to do that? In Eric's diary, natural selection, it's the best thing that ever happened to the earth, getting rid of all the stupid and weak organisms. But it's all natural. Yes. Pretty poisonous worldview. Okay? Why I'm here today, there's a lot of different reasons God was working on me. But back at a time when I really had a great career in medicine, had a practice that was thriving. I was very involved in our church, in our kids' school activities. I had two wonderful medical assistants working with me. I was just living the American dream, the Christian dream, all that together. God was just blessing all aspects of my life, but I kept having this urge or sensation or whatever you want to call it, that there might be something more to how I wanted to finish out my life. Was medicine something that God had blessed me with? Yes, I had no regrets for having gone to med school and practicing like I had, but I kept feeling just this twinge to do more. Well, at the same time I was having some of those thinking processes, a young man that I had actually been a camp counselor with, I was the senior member and he was my junior counselor while he was home. He was doing an internship at the church I attended at the time. And we together led a cabin of fourth graders at camp and had a blast together. He was a gifted, talented, the kids loved him, just had a great heart for Jesus for all I could tell. Later on he goes back to his home, which he was from. He wasn't from Texas, I think it was maybe Louisiana. And then years later he's married, has kids, and moves back to my area in the Dallas area, Garland actually, and starts coming to see me as a patient. And this is probably 15 years or so since we had worked together at camp. Maybe not that long, but anyway, the point was maybe 10 years anyway. He comes in one day, and I'm asking him how things are going, and I knew that he had had a slip up. I'd heard through grapevines that he had had an affair, but his wife and he were going to work through it and get reconciled and all that. And I was kind of just, he came to see me for some non-serious kind of thing, maybe a sore throat or something. But I just took the time to ask him how he was doing. And he shared with me that he no longer believed in God. And I was just blown away. And what book had he read? The God Delusion. And what did that book told him? And other writings of Dawkins? There's no reason to have to be married just to one woman. You can have affairs, and both of you can have an open marriage and just enjoy life as it is. And he and his wife, he convinced her. We can be married, but we can also have an open marriage and sleep around with other people too. But he had his justification, right? If he doesn't believe in God anymore, why would he not want to do things like that? But it just made me angry. And I'll be honest with you, I was a little bit afraid of who this Dawkins guy, I'd heard him, but I hadn't read his stuff yet. But not long after that, another young man who'd grown up in our church had a similar story. Lost his faith, and I was getting really angry at this time. And honestly, I just didn't know quite how to deal with that. Well, God was working on me, and I think he had a plan that I just didn't see at the time. But I'll go back to that in just a bit. But let's look again at this whole idea of the fruits of materialism. You know, Darwin, if you ever read any scientific literature, there's a tree of life that starts out with single-celled animals at the base of it, and then it gets more and more complex and branches out into birds go one way, and reptiles go one way, and ground mammals and big mammals, and there's just more, and then eventually, you know, you follow the apes out, and eventually it becomes man. It's just branching tree of life. That's the Darwin thing in textbooks. But really, if you look at materialism, you know, Darwin really was a strong influence on both Freud and Marx. He gave them reasons not to believe in God and led them down their ways toward, you know, Freud's view of psychiatry was very materialistic, not based on any kind of supernatural thing. Marx's view of utopia had nothing to do with God. But look at other things that are come along with that. Moral relativism, which is kind of what we're going to talk about in the sermon this morning, in the second part. This idea of what really is truth. The sexual revolution, denial of personal responsibility, totalitarian politics, eugenics. You know, Hitler was a true atheist and followed Darwin, despite what some people try to tell you. He had a Christian background, but he was not a practicing Christian. Eugenics, I don't know if you know what that is, but that's where it happened, it was very active in the early half of the 20th century before World War II, where people were sterilizing young ladies because they thought they weren't fit to have children. And they were doing forced sterilizations. They were purging. Hitler was the full-blown Darwin got a seed. He was getting rid of all cripples, all mentally retarded. And of course, that they had the mindset if they were of the wrong race. He was killing people just to purge the populations, and so kind of doing Darwin's work for him. But that was all based on this whole tree that led to this thing. And, you know, infanticide with abortion, if you're not a believer, none of these things have any other reason other than what you think you're doing is just based on helping the world be better from our limited standpoint without a true value that God gives us. So, we're going to get to this verse is not an official verse of the Discovery Institute because we're not officially a religious people, officially. As I told you, most of my people that I work with are very deep, committed Christians. And one of the scriptures we all talk about amongst ourselves is this one. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. God's truth is unitary. You will find God through His Word, through fellow Christians, but also through his creation. And if you go into creation looking for God, you're going to find him, okay? And if you think about this, the false ideas, there's a lot of false ideas in our culture today. And the thought that God doesn't exist is the greatest one, in my opinion. But they're the greatest obstacles to the gospel. And this is my point, why this is important to us. It's hard to get someone to want to follow Jesus if they doesn't believe that the supernatural is even possible, which is our culture's trying to tell us today. And so you've got to go to battle to demolish these arguments, okay? So false ideas are the greatest obstacles to the gospel. We will see only in awaiting a straggler here and there if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation to be controlled by false ideas, which by force of logic prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. If you're atheist, you kind of are upstream of almost anything that makes it important to be believers, right? Obviously. So, what does Romans tell us? The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. When Darwin came around, he was trying to make this scripture irrelevant by giving people a reason to think that creation could happen without God. But intuitively, this is really interesting. Child development people that are atheists will tell you this. This is not just a Christian idea I'm about to share with you. But people that specialize in child development says every 4 or 5-year-old in that age range raised by atheist parents will nonetheless have a concept of God, no matter how they were brought up. Why? Because they look around them and they know this is not an accident. Even a 4-year-old knows that. So what we're trying to do is restore that childlike faith. So using what God has made to demolish arguments. In 1996, about the same time the Center for Science and Culture was formed, Michael Behe put his career on the line. He's a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University. He was educated at the University of Pennsylvania. Very brilliant man who was raised basically as what you call a theistic evolutionist. He had a Christian faith of sorts, but his particular brand of faith, the people around him believed that God did his creating through Darwin. And so he was just going along with it in his science. He was going along with it, but he kept noticing things in his science. And one of the things he noticed was a specific kind of bacteria that has a little flagellum, which is like a tail. And the more he studied that tail, he realized it was like an outboard motor. It had all the parts: stator, rotor, drive shaft. So he thought, somehow, yeah. But he started thinking more, and he looked at this and said, this is irreducibly complex. What does that mean? It means that you can't explain an engine as something that just fell together by some unguided process. It's too complex for that to occur. There is no gradual process that makes this engine come together in a Darwin mechanism. But that little bacteria would not survive without a functioning rotor. So you couldn't gain one part of the rotor and another so many billions of years or millions of years, then gain another part. No, you die. If the rotor doesn't work, you die. It has to all come together and work. And so Behe looks at that, and then he looks at the human blood clotting system. It's a super complex clotting system that keeps us from making too much clots or bleeding to death. It goes one way or the other if it's not perfectly in balance, but it's got multiple components. it cannot be explained by a gradual process. Either it all works or it doesn't. That's what irreducibly complex is. It's not partially effective. It's an all or nothing concept. Well, he notices this and writes the book Darwin's Black Box and comes out as a scientist who pretty much puts himself in the line of fire for him to dare question the academic emperor who had no clothes. He was basically pointing out, you got problems with this theory. Complex systems that had to have all components from the start or there would be no function does not fit a gradual, unguided process. He continues to get critical. You know, that was in '96. It's almost 30 years later. Many people still just really go after him. So, back to my story. I'm very concerned about this whole concept of Richard Dawkins, and I'm frankly afraid to read his book. Am I going to be able to answer the questions? It's turned all these other kids away from God. I was a little afraid of it. Well, fortunately for me, one day I was trying to find some stuff on the internet that might help me with some of these young men who were fighting, and I found a book called Signature in the Cell, and the undertitle or the subtitle was DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. Well, I'm a physician, I know what DNA is, and I was immediately intrigued by this title. What? And I read a little bit more and I said, man, I need to read this. So I bought the book. I didn't know who Stephen Meyer was, but I bought his book. And in that book, some really neat things happened. In his book, he basically had done a doctorate in history and philosophy of science at Cambridge University in England. And the thesis he wrote for his doctoral dissertation, he turned into this book. And basically, he was looking at origin of life, not really Darwin. You know, Darwin really, just as an aside, Darwin doesn't really talk about the origin of life, how the first cell formed. He alludes to it, but nonetheless, as a materialist, he believed it had to form somehow out of chemicals. Just chemicals had to come together, and somehow life happens. Just enough things happen. Well, Steve Meyer decided he's going to really dig that for his doctoral thesis. Where is origin of life research? And so he writes his thesis on this topic, looking for the latest information in the quest to find a naturalistic explanation of the order. So how can we get that first living cell that then will evolve into everything else? But we've got to have it first. And so that's what his book and his doctoral thesis were about. And in that book, he used research by another Christian who was at Cambridge that came right behind him. Just as Steve had moved back to the United States to start teaching college, a young man had left the U.S. to do postdoctoral research at Cambridge on how proteins are created. And Douglas Axe determined, now, we have trillions of cells. Our human body has trillions of cells. But this is on one little cell and one little bacteria. And I'm not going to try to get you a whole science education today, but DNA codes, like a computer code, for a protein by putting a certain sequence of amino acids together. Each little part of the DNA codes for one amino acid, then another, then another, then another. And think of let's think of human code. We code for a paragraph on a computer. When you type in on your computer or on your cell phone or whatever and type in and you print out a whole paragraph of a message you want to send to somebody, how specific is that message if you start messing with some of the order of the letters and spaces and punctuation mark and all that? It doesn't take much to get a non-functional paragraph if you're blindly typing, right? Well, the sequence of DNA is even more specific than that. And for a protein usually is made up of at least 150 amino acids in a certain sequence. And just any sequence does not work. And Douglas Axe did research painstakingly on one specific ton of bacteria and found out that the odds of that sequence of amino acids to come together to make one protein, this is one little cell, one protein, the odds of that happening without design, by just an accidental natural process, 1 in 10 to the 77th power. Now that's 1,000 is 1 times 10 to the 3rd. 1,000,000 is 10 to the 5th. 10 to the 77th is beyond billions, beyond trillions, beyond quadrillions. It's out there. In relative terms, that's like finding one atom in the Milky Way galaxy with blinders on. The odds of finding that proper sequence, there's not enough time. No matter what age of the Earth a scientist wants to believe in, there is not enough time for one little cell to make one specific protein. The origin of life defies science. We're not talking about Genesis 1 stuff here. We're talking about laboratory science. This article was published in a mainstream biology journal that's still, well reputable. So in that book, I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, I'm not scared of Richard Dawkins anymore because he can't answer the math here. The math doesn't work. So I happened to be one day in a half-price bookstore, and I found that book, and I bought it because I didn't want him to get a dime of my money. So I bought a used copy of his book, and I read through his book, and I saw poor arguments after poor arguments after poor arguments, circular logic, false information. But it's seductive, folks. If you don't know some of that science, it's incredibly seductive. So, I could see how these young men would have been seduced by his devilish scheme. But when you know what you're doing in the highest levels of science by men like my friend and now boss, Stephen Meyer, you understand that we have nothing to apologize for. God's creation, just like it says in Romans, speaks to him. It can't be answered without him. So I read one book by Stephen Meyer, and I heard a few years later that another one's coming out. And this one was called Darwin's Doubt. Now, in the first book, it was about the origin of life. His second book was about what happens in the evolution of life. When we see, supposedly according to Darwin, a sequence of events where a bird turns into, or a dinosaur turns into a bird, and just all these things, or an ape turns into a man. You see all these sequences. And Darwin, in his own book, in The Origin of Species, that he first put out in the mid-1800s, he admitted that the Cambrian explosion, Cambrian is a fossil layer. There's other layers that all have names in the geological record. And in that fossil layer, multiple phyla. If you do a classification system, kingdom is like animal kingdom, plant kingdom. Those are the biggest classifications. Well, right below that is phyla. And so within the animal kingdom are the insects, the spiders, the mammals, the various different things. In that one fossil layer, over half of the phyla that we're aware of today showed up in that one layer. In the earlier layers, historically, there was no evidence of them. And in a geologic timescale, think of a 24-hour day as the entire history of the Earth. Whatever the length of the Earth is, let's just call it 24 hours old, okay? 3 seconds is how much time elapsed in the Cambrian, in the whole history of the geologic timescale. In that 3-second window, over half of the animal types developed all at once, in theory, and that was what he said in his book. Now, when he wrote his book, he said, well, the reason that we don't have the answers to this, we'll find those. We're going to find those. We'll do more digging, look in more layers, more places. We'll find all of these sequences and explain how they happened, and that really does follow my theory. That was what his prediction was. Well, Steve Meyer decided, let's look at that and revisit the latest findings and documents. And the information needed for new body plans, if you want to go from a mouse to an elephant, any geologic timeline, there is no way the information you need to do to create that could happen with the time available. So, in other words, there's problems in our science, not in our theology. So, he writes his most recent book a couple of years ago called The Return of the God Hypothesis. And in that, he talks about evidence in the last century that people like Einstein and other astrophysicists discovered that the universe had a beginning. Before this discovery, when Einstein and Hubble, whom the Hubble telescope was named after, before those guys started doing their studies, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, was also an astrophysicist as well. Interesting. But before they all figured out, wait a minute, the universe is expanding. Well, if you turn the clock back, that means you bring it back and eventually down into one thing. The universe had to have a start somewhere. Well, that goes against the materialist philosophy, because a start means it had to be a cause outside the matter that started it. And they call it the Big Bang. Don't get misguided about the term Big Bang. That's actually our friend. Because what's the Big Bang? It's not a cause. It's an effect. Meaning there was a life onset that it started. Kind of hits Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created. In the beginning. That is not a materialist concept. And Stephen Hawking, who I showed a few minutes ago, passed away about 5 years ago. His doctoral thesis, basically when he got his PhD from Cambridge, his doctoral thesis was the idea of a singularity where there was a beginning event. And he spent the rest of his career trying to undo his own doctoral thesis because the beginning concept drove him crazy from a God standpoint. It made him very uncomfortable because he knew good and well if there was a beginning to the universe, then you had to find the cause of that beginning, and that was going to be God. And he knew it, and he spent the rest of his life using very poor philosophy in trying to do that. In this book, Dr. Meyer talks a lot about Hawking, does it very respectfully. Remember, we're demolishing arguments, not people. We don't win the battle by being ugly like the enemy does. We win it by being Christ-like. But nonetheless, he was very respectful, but he points out the philosophical loopholes that Hawking had. So the universe has a beginning. It's been fine-tuned. Every physicist, atheist or otherwise, one of the most famous atheists that he's already passed away from cancer is Christopher Hitchens. And he was asked what was the hardest thing he could explain. It was the fine-tuning. That means gravity, electrical magnetic spectrum, all of these are so finely tuned that if they were just a little bit off, the universe would not have allowed life to occur. And that's not an argument within science. Fine-tuning is accepted by the atheist. It's just the fine-tuner that's not. And then also in his book, he goes back over the complex information. He just kind of re-summarizes what he did in his first two books. But he's using what God has made to demolish the arguments. It's right there for us if we look at nature. So look, Fred Hoyle he hated the idea of the beginning of the universe. He was a staunch atheist. This is a picture of him at Cambridge where he taught. But he eventually himself came around, says the common sense interpretation of data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology. The more he studied, the more he had to recognize there had to be a component outside of matter and energy that explained the order in both biology as well as the universe. So I'm going to be closing up in just a second here. Let me go on real quick. Back to this materialism. And let's look at it a different way. If we put God back in this, what's it look like? Strong marriages, objective moral standards, personal responsibility, evangelism, sanctity of life, intelligent design. We start and look for the design, we point to God and the things that come from it. So, let me just say this, the battle is not limited to academic and college level, okay? We've got high-level scientists that fight that battle at that level, but we've got a problem. We've got to start equipping our kids when they're little, okay? Now, we can't put them through chemistry and physics, right? Okay, just be clear. Basically, we obviously have to show them the love of Jesus in the way we live our lives and the way we serve others and things like that. But they also can be taught to think. I'm going to show you some See that says foundationworldview.com? You guys will have access to my slides, and there's some resources here I want you to have. But foundationworldview.com is run by a lady that lives in Atlanta named Elizabeth Urbanowitz, and she starts helping parents get their kids to start thinking critically when they're preschool, like 4 years old and above. And we got to start at those ages. There's a lot of other resources there. We have a Science and Faith conference in February. You guys can register and watch it online. Rather, if you want to come to Dallas and watch it live, you'll hear people like Stephen Meyer and several of our other scientists talk about evidence for God from science. We don't have to give this argument up, folks. It's God's argument, and all we got to do is point people to his science, the unitary truth that points to him, just like Romans says. Do I have time for any questions? Or we have, okay. Questions? Any? I know I've gone through this pretty fast. Sorry about all that. But feel free to reach out to Jim if you want to ask questions. Please look at these resources and use them. There's a lot of things that are youth-oriented in there. I just appreciate the opportunity. Yes, Jim?
I have the slides. I can email them to anybody.
That's fine. I get excited about this stuff.